The coffee mug in my hand almost slipped from my fingers. The ceramic was still warm, steam rising in lazy spirals, but my grip had gone numb. Across the conference table, the vice president leaned back in his chair with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from never having faced real consequences. "You're dead weight here," he said, his voice carrying that smooth, practiced tone of someone who delivered this speech before. "Your division is being liquidated, effective immediately. Pack your things and be out by end of day." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone coughed nervously. 3 other members of my team sat frozen in their chairs, their faces draining of color as they processed what this meant for them too. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at him, this man who'd been systematically dismantling divisions for 6 months, and I was doing the mental calculations. 48 hours ago, I'd signed the paperwork. 48 hours ago, I'd purchased $17 million in active bank debt that this company owed. The ink was barely dry, and he had no idea what was coming. Welcome to the Payback Office channel, where karma doesn't just knock on the door, it owns the mortgage. If stories about accountability and justice resonate with you, hitting that subscribe button helps us build this community together. We're working towards 6,000 subscribers, and having you here makes that possible. My name is Kristina Volkov, and until this moment, I was the Director of Advanced Development for the Piezoelectric Sensor Division at Hexagon Dynamics. I'd spent 12 years building that division from a speculative R&D project into a $23 million revenue stream. My background wasn't what you'd call privileged. I'd worked my way through community college while taking care of my younger brother after our mom got sick. But those years taught me something valuable. They taught me to see people. To understand when someone was struggling, when someone needed a chance, when someone was being underestimated. That empathy had built my division. Every person I'd hired had a story. Every innovation we'd developed had come from creating an environment where people felt valued enough to take risks. And now this man, whose arrival 6 months ago had been the beginning of the end, was erasing all of it with the stroke of a pen. Let me take you back to where this really began. 9 months earlier, the rumors had started circulating. Hexagon Dynamics was restructuring. The executive team was being reshuffled. Our CEO, Richard Pemberton, who'd always been supportive of the R&D divisions, was stepping down for personal reasons, which everyone knew meant the board had pushed him out. I'd been with Hexagon long enough to recognize the warning signs. New leadership usually meant new priorities, and new priorities usually meant casualties. But the Piezoelectric Sensor Division had been performing well. We just secured 2 major contracts with aerospace manufacturers. Our sensors were being integrated into next-generation flight control systems. We were profitable, growing, and innovative. I thought we were safe. The new CEO arrived in early September. His name was Anthony Westbrook, and he came from a background in private equity. That should have been my first red flag. Private equity people see companies differently, not as organizations of people working toward a common goal, but as collections of assets to be optimized, trimmed, and flipped for maximum return. Westbrook's first company-wide email talked about lean operations and core competency focus and eliminating redundancy. Corporate speak for layoffs and division closures. I scheduled a meeting with him for the second week of September. I wanted to present our division's performance metrics, our pipeline of upcoming contracts, our growth projections. I wanted to make sure he understood what we brought to the table. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. Westbrook sat behind his massive oak desk, barely glancing at the presentation I'd spent a week preparing. His office still smelled like fresh paint from the renovations he'd ordered. Behind him, through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline stretched out in crisp autumn clarity. "Kristina," he'd said, interrupting me mid-sentence about our aerospace contracts. "I appreciate the passion, but I need you to understand something. Hexagon Dynamics is a thermal management solutions company. That's our brand identity. That's where our margins are strongest. These specialty divisions, sensors, electromagnetic compatibility testing, microfluidic fabrication, they're distractions. But sir, we generated $23 million in revenue last year. On what operational overhead?" He'd leaned forward then, his expression not unkind but utterly dismissive. "I've reviewed the numbers. Your division requires specialized manufacturing facilities, specialized equipment, specialized personnel. The return on invested capital is mediocre at best. We can deploy those resources more efficiently elsewhere. I'd left that meeting with a sinking feeling in my stomach. Over the next month, I watched Westbrook systematically dismantle everything that had made Hexagon Dynamics innovative. The electromagnetic compatibility testing lab was shuttered. The microfluidic fabrication team was sold off to a competitor. The advanced materials research group was reduced to a skeleton crew. And then came the announcement about the new vice president of operations. His name was Thaddeus Moreland, and according to the press release, he was being brought in to streamline operational efficiency and optimize resource allocation. More corporate speak. More warning signs. That was 6 months ago. Thaddeus Moreland arrived on a cold March morning, and from day one, he carried himself like a man on a mission. He was in his early 40s, with sharp features and expensive suits that whispered old money. His background was consulting, 15 years at a top-tier firm specializing in corporate turnarounds, which really meant he specialized in cutting things. His first week, he scheduled one-on-one meetings with every division head. Mine was on a Wednesday afternoon. Moreland's office was already personalized, family photos in expensive frames, diplomas from prestigious universities, some kind of abstract art that probably cost more than my car. He gestured to a chair across from his desk without looking up from his laptop. Kristina Volkov, Piezoelectric Sensor Division, he'd said, reading from his screen. 12 years with the company, MBA from Northwestern. Division revenue $23 million, operational costs $18.4 million. Net contribution $4.6 million before overhead allocation. That's correct, I'd said carefully. Tell me why your division should continue to exist. Not tell me about your division or what are your growth plans. Just straight to justifying our existence. I'd given him the pitch, the aerospace contracts, the IP portfolio, the growth trajectory, the client relationships. He'd listened with the kind of polite attention that meant he was already forming counterarguments. Interesting, he'd said when I finished. Here's what I see. A division that requires specialized expertise we can't easily redeploy. Manufacturing facilities that sit idle 40% of the time. A client base concentrated in aerospace, which is notoriously cyclical. And a product line that's tangential to Hexagon's core thermal management competencies. With respect, Mr. Moreland, that's a very narrow way to evaluate strategic value. Strategic value is another way of saying doesn't generate sufficient returns, but we're emotionally attached to it. He'd smiled then, not unkindly, but with absolute confidence. I've seen 100 divisions like yours, Miss Volkov. They're built by passionate people who do good work, but good work isn't the same as optimal resource allocation. That meeting had lasted 20 minutes, and I'd left knowing exactly what was coming. Not immediately, Moreland was too strategic for that, but eventually. My division was on borrowed time. Over the next 6 months, I watched him work. He was methodical, systematic, and completely ruthless. The thermal dynamics test lab was consolidated with another division, 12 people laid off. The specialty coatings unit was sold to a competitor, 37 jobs eliminated. The fluid systems integration team was outsourced, 21 people gone. Each time, Moreland followed the same pattern. He'd spend weeks analyzing the division, identifying inefficiencies, building his case. Then he'd present to Westbrook and the executive team with PowerPoint presentations full of cost-benefit analyses and resource optimization models. Then the announcement would come, and another part of Hexagon's innovation capacity would disappear. The piezoelectric sensor division was still operating, but I could feel the attention turning our way. Moreland had started asking for detailed operational reports. He'd toured our manufacturing facility twice. He'd requested interviews with our major clients, ostensibly to understand the value proposition, but really to assess how locked in they were. I knew we were next. The question was when and what I was going to do about it. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in late September, 6 months into Moreland's tenure. I was working late, reviewing quarterly projections, when I got an email from one of our aerospace clients. Pinnacle Aviation Systems wanted to schedule a call to discuss supply chain continuity concerns. Reading between the lines, They'd heard rumors about Hexagon's restructuring and were worried about our division's future. I sat back in my chair and stared at that email for a long time. If Moreland liquidated us, what would actually happen? Our clients would scramble to find alternative suppliers. Our employees would scatter to competitors, taking their expertise with them. Our IP would either get sold off piecemeal or gather dust in Hexagon's patent portfolio. And I would get a severance package and a handshake and a thank you for your service. That was the conventional outcome. That was what happened to every other division Moreland had eliminated. But what if there was another way? I pulled up Hexagon's financial statements, publicly available information since we were a traded company. The debt structure was right there in the footnotes. $17 million in revolving credit from Continental Commerce Bank, issued 3 years ago to finance an acquisition. The terms were standard: variable interest rate, 5-year maturity, various covenants about financial ratios and operational changes. I'd learned about corporate debt in my MBA program, but it had always been theoretical. Now, staring at those numbers, I started thinking about it differently. What if I could acquire that debt? The idea was insane on its face. I didn't have $17 million. But debt doesn't trade at face value. It trades based on the perceived risk of the borrower. And Hexagon, with all its restructuring chaos and leadership changes, was definitely looking riskier than it had 3 years ago. But more importantly, what would owning that debt actually give me? I opened a new document and started writing out the logic. Benefit 1, leverage in negotiations. Benefit 2, change of control protection. Benefit 3, alignment of interests. Benefit 4, downside protection. Benefit 5, strategic optionality. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Not as a guarantee, this was absolutely a high-risk play, but as a strategic move that changed the entire game board. Moreland was operating from a playbook that assumed employees were powerless. He could analyze divisions, make recommendations, and execute terminations because the people in those divisions had no structural leverage to fight back. They could complain, they could argue, but ultimately they could be dismissed. But creditors couldn't be dismissed. Creditors had legal rights that survived termination. Creditors had power that existed outside the corporate hierarchy. If I could become a creditor, I could change my position from pawn to player. I sat in that office until nearly midnight, running scenarios, calculating risks, making lists of who I'd need to call and what I'd need to say. By the time I left, I had the skeleton of a plan. It was audacious. It was possibly crazy. It would require convincing investors to bet millions of dollars on my judgment. It would require perfect timing and absolute discretion. But it was better than waiting around to be declared dead weight by a consultant who'd never spent a day building anything real. The next morning, I had breakfast with Elliot Zhao at a diner near the financial district. Elliot and I had worked together years ago at a different company before he'd transitioned into commercial banking. We'd stayed in touch, the occasional lunch, industry conferences, the kind of professional friendship that's valuable precisely because it exists outside your immediate workplace. Over coffee and eggs, I laid out the situation. Moreland's systematic dismantling of divisions, the signs pointing toward my division being next, the debt structure I'd identified. I want to acquire it, I said, not as a hostile move, as a defensive one. Elliot had set down his coffee cup slowly. Kristina, do you understand what you're talking about? Corporate debt acquisition isn't something you do on a whim. We're talking about millions of dollars in capital, legal complexity, timing coordination. I know. That's why I'm talking to you. I need to understand if this is even possible. He'd been quiet for a moment, then pulled out his tablet and started making notes. Okay, let's think this through. Continental Commerce holds the debt. I know people there. Given Hexagon's current instability, they might actually be willing to sell at a discount, maybe 85, 90 cents on the dollar. They'd rather lock in a small loss than risk a bigger one if Hexagon hits real trouble. So it's possible? Possible, yes. But you'd need to come up with roughly $14 to $15 million, and you'd need to do it quietly. If Hexagon gets wind of what you're doing before the transaction closes, they could interfere. Maybe find alternative financing, maybe accelerate their timeline on liquidating your division. What if I brought in co-investors? People who have a strategic interest in my division continuing to exist? Elliot had looked up from his tablet, and I'd seen the moment he understood. Your clients. You want to bring in your aerospace clients as investors. And maybe some private equity firms that specialize in carve-outs. And maybe some individual investors I know who have been telling me for years I should start my own company. You're not just trying to save your division. You're building a coalition that could potentially take it independent. I'm building leverage, I'd corrected. What happens after that depends on how Hexagon responds. Over the next 2 weeks, Elliot helped me map out the mechanics. We identified Continental Commerce as the debt holder and confirmed they were open to selling. We structured a special purpose vehicle, an LLC that would exist solely to hold the debt and bring together multiple investors. Then I started making calls. The first call was to Pinnacle Aviation Systems, specifically to their VP of Supply Chain, a woman named Beatrice Hoffman, who I'd worked with for 6 years. Beatrice, I need to talk to you about something sensitive, not over email. Can we meet in person? We'd met at a hotel bar near O'Hare Airport, neutral territory. I'd explained the situation, Moreland's pattern of liquidations, the threat to my division, the potential disruption to Pinnacle's supply chain. Here's what I'm proposing, I'd said. I'm putting together an investment group to acquire Hexagon's bank debt. If we own that debt, we have leverage to prevent the division from being liquidated, or at minimum to ensure continuity of supply even if there's a transition. Beatrice had listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the legal structure, the timeline, the risks. Finally, she'd said, "How much are you looking for from Pinnacle?" $3 million. That's not a trivial amount. I'd need to take this to our CFO and probably our CEO. I understand. But consider what you'd lose if we get liquidated. You'd have to requalify a new supplier, which takes months. You'd have potential delays on aircraft deliveries. You'd lose access to our development pipeline for next-generation sensors. $3 million is less than the cost of that disruption. She'd made the pitch internally, and 3 days later, Pinnacle had committed the $3 million. The second call was to Watershed Capital Partners, a private equity firm that specialized in carve-out acquisitions. I'd met one of their partners, a man named Isaac Drummond, at an industry conference the previous year. Isaac had been immediately interested. This is exactly the kind of situation we look for. A good business trapped inside a larger company that doesn't value it. If you can create the leverage to force a transaction, we want in for $4 million. 2 individual investors, both former executives who'd made their fortunes in successful exits, each committed $2 million after I walked them through the opportunity. And I committed the final $2.8 million, which represented essentially every dollar I'd saved over 12 years, and everything I could borrow against my home and retirement accounts. By early October, I had the coalition assembled. Cascade Holdings LLC was formed with 6 investors, each holding membership interests proportional to their capital contribution. On October 18th, exactly 6 months and 2 weeks after Thaddeus Moreland had arrived at Hexagon Dynamics, I signed the paperwork at Continental Commerce Bank's downtown office. Cascade Holdings LLC acquired $17 million in Hexagon Dynamics debt for $14.9 million. The transaction was public record, but buried in the daily flow of corporate debt trading. I was betting Moreland wouldn't notice until it was too late. I was betting he'd make his move against my division without doing his homework. 2 days later, I got the email scheduling the divisional integration meeting for Thursday morning. I knew what it meant. The time had come. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray. I got to the office early, made coffee, and sat at my desk reviewing the paperwork one more time. The debt acquisition documents, the LLC operating agreement, the change of control provisions in Hexagon's original loan agreement. Everything was in order. Now it was just a matter of timing. At 9 a.m., I walked into the conference room with my team, 4 senior engineers and 2 project managers. Thaddeus Moreland was already there, flanked by 2 consultants I recognized from previous division liquidations. His laptop was open, his presentation already loaded. He didn't stand when we entered. No greeting, no pleasantries. Just a gesture toward the chairs. "Let's make this efficient," he'd said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of polite dismissiveness. I've reviewed the operational analysis of the piezoelectric sensor division. The conclusion is straightforward. The division requires disproportionate capital investment relative to its contribution to core revenue streams. The manufacturing facilities are underutilized by industry standards. The personnel costs exceed comparable market rates. The client concentration in aerospace presents unacceptable risk exposure. Angela Walsh, one of my senior engineers, had started to respond. Sir, if I could clarify the client diversification strategy Moreland had held up a hand. I'm not here for a debate. The analysis is complete. The decision has been made at the executive level. The piezoelectric sensor division is being liquidated, effective immediately. You'll receive severance packages in accordance with company policy. HR will provide details regarding timeline and transition. The room had gone silent. I could feel my team's eyes turning toward me, waiting for me to say something, to fight back, to do anything. That's when Moreland had looked directly at me, and that's when he delivered the line he probably thought was professional candor. "You're dead weight here." I'd let those words hang in the air for a moment. Around the table, my team sat frozen, some angry, some devastated. Angela had tears forming in her eyes. Raymond Torres, my manufacturing director, had his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. But I'd simply nodded, carefully set down my coffee mug, and stood up. "Understood," I'd said calmly. "I'll need to make some phone calls regarding the transition. May I use the conference room for a few minutes?" Moreland had waved dismissively. "Make it quick. Building security will be coordinating the exit process by noon." My team had filed out, their faces shell-shocked. I'd closed the conference room door behind them and pulled out my phone. Elliot Zhao answered on the second ring. "It happened," I said simply. "Execute phase 2. "You're absolutely sure?" Elliot's voice was cautious. "Once we trigger this, there's no walking it back." "I'm sure. He just terminated the entire division. Do it." What Elliot did next was technically simple but practically nuclear. As the designated representative of Cascade Holdings, LLC, the entity that now owned $17 million in Hexagon Dynamics debt, he contacted the company's chief financial officer and formally invoked the change of control clause in the debt agreement. The letter was precise and legally airtight. Hexagon Dynamics had announced and begun executing a major operational restructuring, including the liquidation of the piezoelectric sensor division and multiple other divisions over the previous 6 months. This constituted a material change in the company's operational structure. Under Section 7.3(b) of the debt agreement, Cascade Holdings was exercising its right to call the debt, demanding immediate repayment of $17 million within 30 days, or we would initiate foreclosure proceedings. I'd been standing by the conference room windows, watching the normal office activity below, when I heard the commotion. Milton Burgess, Hexagon's chief accountant, was practically running down the hallway. His face had gone ashen, that grayish-white color that comes from sudden shock. His tie was askew, and he was clutching a folder of papers like a life preserver. He burst into Moreland's office without knocking. Even through the closed door, I could hear his voice, higher-pitched than normal. "We have a severe problem." I stayed where I was and watched through the glass walls as the crisis unfolded. Moreland's office was 30 feet away, separated by the same transparent walls that were supposed to promote collaborative culture. Milton was gesturing frantically at the documents, his mouth moving rapidly. Moreland had gone very still, his earlier casual confidence replaced by sharp focus. One of the consultants got on a phone. The other started typing urgently on a laptop. 3 minutes later, Anthony Westbrook appeared, moving through the office with the kind of purposeful stride that meant someone's world was about to end. He entered Moreland's office, and the door closed. Blinds were drawn. I walked back to my division's workspace. My team was clustered together, some packing boxes half-heartedly, others just standing around in stunned silence. "What's happening?" Raymond Torres asked, noticing my expression. "There's some kind of emergency in the executive wing." "I imagine they're discovering that liquidating divisions has consequences," I said calmly. "Keep packing, but slowly. I don't think anyone's going anywhere today." Angela looked at me, her eyes red but suddenly sharp. "Kristina, what did you do?" Before I could answer, my desk phone rang. internal extension, Westbrook's executive assistant. Miss Volkov, Mr. Westbrook needs to see you immediately in the executive conference room. I'll be right there. The executive conference room was on the top floor, reserved for board meetings and crisis management. When I walked in, 5 people were already there. Westbrook, Moreland, Milton Burgess, the company's general counsel Harriet Blackwell, and an older man I didn't recognize. Silver hair, expensive suit, the unmistakable bearing of high-priced legal counsel. Westbrook didn't stand. His expression was tight with barely controlled fury. "Kristina, sit." I sat. "2 days ago," Westbrook said, his voice clipped and precise, "our corporate debt was purchased by an entity called Cascade Holdings LLC. This morning, that entity invoked a change of control clause and is demanding immediate repayment of $17 million. Milton tells me we don't have that kind of liquid capital available. Are you aware of this situation?" "I'm aware." Thaddeus Moreland leaned forward, and I watched the realization dawn on his face. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. You're behind Cascade Holdings." "I'm a member of the LLC, yes, along with several investors who share an interest in the piezoelectric sensor division's continued operation." The silver-haired man spoke for the first time, his voice measured and professional. "Miss Volkov, I'm Howard Simmons, outside counsel for Hexagon Dynamics. What you've orchestrated here is extraordinarily aggressive. Some would characterize it as a conflict of interest, possibly even tortious interference with business operations." I met his gaze evenly. "I acquired debt on the open market using private capital. Continental Commerce Bank was happy to sell. There's nothing illegal or unethical about that transaction. If anything, Hexagon should be pleased that your debt is now held by someone who actually understands the business." Harriet Blackwell, the general counsel, shook her head. "This is unprecedented. An employee acquiring their employer's debt as leverage." "Former employee," I interrupted quietly. "As of approximately 30 minutes ago, Mr. Moreland liquidated my division and terminated my employment." "I'm dead weight, I believe he said." The room went completely silent. Westbrook closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and turned to Moreland. The look on his face could have stripped paint off walls. "You terminated her this morning. Before verifying the debt situation?" I had no reason to believe. How could I have possibly known? Moreland's confidence had evaporated. Sweat was beading on his forehead. "Perhaps," I said quietly, "if you'd spent more time understanding the divisions you were liquidating, instead of just running them through optimization models, you'd have understood the relationships and leveraged those divisions represented." Moreland's face flushed red. "This is extortion. You can't seriously expect." "I'm not extorting anyone," I said calmly. "I'm a debt holder exercising legal rights that are clearly spelled out in the loan agreement. If Hexagon wants to discuss restructuring those obligations, I'm happy to negotiate. But that negotiation will be between equals, not between an executive and someone he just declared dead weight." Howard Simmons cleared his throat, regaining control of the conversation. "Miss Volkov, let's discuss what outcome you're seeking. Cascade Holdings is demanding $17 million in 30 days. We both know Hexagon cannot meet that timeline without severe disruption. What would it take to restructure this debt on more manageable terms?" This was the moment. I'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but now that it was happening, my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I want 3 things," I said. "First, the piezoelectric sensor division is not liquidated. It continues operating as a going concern with its current team intact." Westbrook shook his head. "The operational analysis clearly shows." The operational analysis was conducted by consultants who spent 3 weeks reviewing spreadsheets and 0 hours understanding the strategic value of what we've built, I said flatly. "We hold critical intellectual property in sensor technology. We have binding contracts with aerospace manufacturers who rely on our products for flight safety systems. Liquidating us doesn't just cost you current revenue, it destroys client relationships and damages Hexagon's reputation as a reliable partner." Milton Burgess spoke up, his voice still shaky. "She's right about the client relationships. Pinnacle Aviation called an hour ago asking about supply continuity guarantees. If we can't provide them, they've indicated they'll need to resource alternative suppliers for all Hexagon products, not just sensors. That got Westbrook's attention. Pinnacle was one of Hexagon's largest clients across multiple divisions. "What's your second condition?" Harriet Blackwell asked, making notes. "Operational autonomy. The division becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of Hexagon with its own profit and loss statement, its own decision-making authority. Hexagon benefits from our revenue and our client relationships, but you stop treating us like a cost center to be optimized out of existence." "And the third condition?" Howard Simmons asked. "Everyone who was terminated this morning is reinstated immediately with full back pay and benefits. And Mr. Moreland no longer has any operational authority over the piezoelectric sensor division or its personnel." Moreland's face went from red to purple. "You cannot seriously expect—" "I'm not negotiating with you," I said, cutting him off. "I'm negotiating with Mr. Westbrook and the board. You've been here 6 months and you've created a $17 million crisis. Your judgment regarding my division is clearly compromised." Westbrook was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the conference table. "If we agree to these terms, what happens to the debt?" "Cascade Holdings restructures it into a 5-year note at a reasonable interest rate. We'll work with your legal team to draft terms that provide certainty for both sides. And when the piezoelectric sensor division hits the growth targets I'm projecting, which we will, Hexagon will be in a strong position to repay early and regain complete control." Howard Simmons was already running calculations on his tablet. "That's actually more than reasonable. Why aren't you demanding equity or pushing for a full buyout of the division?" "Because I don't want to destroy Hexagon," I said honestly. "I spent 12 years building something here. I believe in what this company was before it became obsessed with short-term optimization. I want my division to succeed, and I want Hexagon to succeed. But I will not stand by while good people are treated as disposable line items by someone who's never built anything in his life." The formal agreement took 3 weeks to finalize. Lawyers worked through every clause, every contingency, every possible edge case. In the end, Cascade Holdings restructured Hexagon's $17 million in debt into a 5-year note at 6.5% interest, with provisions allowing early repayment without penalty. The piezoelectric sensor division became Hexagon Sensor Technologies, a wholly owned subsidiary with operational independence. I was named president with full authority over hiring, budgeting, strategy, and operations. Every person who'd been terminated that Thursday morning was reinstated. I held a division meeting the day the agreement was signed and told them everything: the debt acquisition, the 6 months of watching Moreland work, the coalition of investors, the negotiation. They deserved to know. Angela Walsh cried again, but from relief this time. Raymond Torres laughed and said he'd known I had something planned, which was absolutely untrue, but I appreciated the confidence. Thaddeus Moreland lasted another 6 weeks before pursuing other opportunities. Westbrook had essentially stripped him of all meaningful authority after the crisis. When someone creates a $17 million problem through sheer arrogance and lack of due diligence, trust is impossible to rebuild. I never spoke to him again after that day in the conference room. He kept to his office, worked on whatever diminished portfolio Westbrook still allowed him to touch, and then one Monday his office was empty and there was a terse internal memo about organizational changes. Sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation. It's simply continuing to succeed while they fade into irrelevance. Over the next 2 years, Hexagon Sensor Technologies exceeded every projection I'd made to the investors. We expanded our aerospace contracts beyond Pinnacle Aviation, bringing in clients from commercial aircraft manufacturers, military drone systems, and eventually a NASA satellite project. The division that Moreland had dismissed as dead weight grew from $23 million in annual revenue to $41 million. We hired 32 new employees, including a brilliant young engineer named Christopher Park, who developed a next-generation pressure sensor that set new industry standards. Angela Walsh was promoted to Vice President of Engineering. Raymond Torres took over advanced manufacturing operations and pioneered new production techniques that improved our margins by 18%. The investors in Cascade Holdings were thrilled. Their high-risk bet on defending a division had turned into a strong-performing asset, generating consistent returns. Watershed Capital Partners approached me multiple times about spinning Hexagon Sensor Technologies into a fully independent company, but I wasn't ready for that. The current structure worked, we had autonomy to innovate and the backing of a larger corporation's resources. In the third year, Hexagon Dynamics repaid the restructured debt in full, 21 months ahead of schedule. The company had stabilized under Westbrook's leadership, once he'd stopped relying solely on consultants who only saw spreadsheets instead of understanding people and products. To his credit, Westbrook called me personally the day the final payment cleared. "Kristina," he'd said, "I owe you an apology. When I first arrived at Hexagon, I was so focused on financial optimization that I nearly destroyed some of our most valuable assets. You taught me something I should have already known. The numbers on a balance sheet don't tell you everything about what makes a business work." "I appreciate that, sir," I'd said. "For what it's worth, you've done good work stabilizing the company. We're much stronger now than we were 3 years ago, thanks to you refusing to let me make a catastrophic mistake." That conversation ended with mutual respect that hadn't existed before. Funny how nearly destroying a company can lead to better understanding. 5 years after that Thursday morning, when I almost dropped my coffee mug, Hexagon Sensor Technologies is preparing for an initial public offering. We're now a $78 million business with 243 employees across 3 facilities. Our sensors are integrated into aerospace applications, medical devices, autonomous vehicle systems, and renewable energy infrastructure. We hold 63 patents with another 14 in the application process. Cascade Holdings LLC was formally dissolved last year, having served its purpose. Every investor received substantial returns on their capital, and several have remained involved as advisors and board members. Elliot Zhao joined our board of directors and occasionally texts me asking if I'm planning any more financial warfare operations. I always respond that once was quite enough for a lifetime. I still encounter people from the old Hexagon days. Milton Burgess retired last year, and at his retirement party, he pulled me aside. "You know," he'd said, "that morning when we discovered what you'd done, I thought my heart was going to give out. But looking back on 40 years in corporate accounting, it was the most impressive strategic move I've ever witnessed." Anthony Westbrook is still CEO of Hexagon Dynamics. The company is performing well, and they've resumed investing in R&D and innovation. Turns out that, when you don't liquidate all your specialty divisions, you maintain technological capabilities that become valuable. I never heard from Thaddeus Moreland again after he left. I occasionally wonder if he learned anything from the experience, if he ever looked back and realized that dead weight was actually carrying more value than he'd bothered to understand. But honestly, I don't think about him often. He was a catalyst for change, nothing more. The people I think about are the ones who were in that conference room that morning. Angela Walsh, who's being recruited by major tech companies but keeps choosing to stay because she believes in what we're building. Raymond Torres, who's become one of the most respected manufacturing experts in our industry. Christopher Park, who just published a paper that's being cited throughout the sensor engineering field. All the people who would have been discarded as dead weight if I hadn't fought back. That coffee mug, the one I almost dropped that Thursday morning, is still on my desk. It's nothing fancy, just a generic ceramic mug with the old Hexagon Dynamics logo from a company event years ago. But I keep it there as a reminder of the moment when everything could have gone one of 2 ways. The moment when I could have accepted the verdict that I was dead weight and walked away. Or the moment when I could stand up and prove that I was actually holding something far more valuable than Thaddeus Moreland had ever bothered to understand. I chose to stand up, and in doing so, I saved 40 jobs that morning, created 200 more over the following years, and built something that continues to grow and innovate and create value, not just financial value, but the kind of value that comes from people doing meaningful work they believe in. That's worth an almost dropped coffee mug. The business world throws around words like disruption and optimization and restructuring as if they're neutral, technical terms. But behind every one of those words are human beings, people with mortgages and children in college and elderly parents to care for, People who have invested years of their lives building expertise and relationships and value. When leaders forget that, when they treat those people as disposable in service of some financial model, they don't just make a moral mistake. They make a strategic mistake, because those people are the company. The relationships are the company. The knowledge and commitment and creativity are the company. Take those away, and you're not optimizing anything. You're just destroying what you don't understand. I'm grateful I was in a position to fight back, to create leverage, to force a different outcome. I'm grateful for the investors who trusted me, the colleagues who supported me, the clients who valued what we'd built enough to put their capital behind protecting it. Not everyone gets that chance. Not everyone has the resources or relationships or positioning to stand up to executives who see them as expendable. But this story exists as proof that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, empathy wins. Understanding wins. Taking the time to see the whole situation instead of just the spreadsheet wins. And the people who underestimate that do so at their own peril. If stories about standing up for what's right resonate with you, that subscribe button helps us keep building this community. We're working towards 6,000 subscribers, and every person who joins makes sharing these stories possible. Thank you for being here.